Hans Zimmer or whoever composed this. Please hire me, please. Dune Part 1. It was definitely one of the best films back when it came out in the cinemas of that particular year. I've got fond memories of seeing it in cinema, and my only regret is not really seeing it on IMAX. It has a very unique take on science fiction world building because the story itself was authored by a man who had experience with reporting, and so he interpreted the world from a very practical perspective, i.e., these groups of people think this way and they're all trying to gain power, so they must all be trying to have one big power game. And that's basically what Dune is. So there's been interesting comparisons between franchises like Dune and Star Trek, or even Warhammer. There have been various attempts at adapting Dune in the past. There was one made by David Finch, but that one wasn't all too successful in capturing the essence of the original story. There had been a mini-series called The Children of Dune, which received critical acclaim, but as for an adaptation of the original Dune book itself, that would require a lot of ambition. Thankfully, Denis Villeneuve, it was Denis Villeneuve who directed the Dune series. Denis Villeneuve, the same director who brought us Blade Runner 2049, he had a vision. Denis Villeneuve has a talent for quality, dreamlike imagery that you can see on the screen. A nice balance between practical and CGI work, and some good directing and writing overall. Denis seemed to have a passion for Dune, and he seemed to be the right man to adapt the Dune franchise. Because Part 1 of Dune seemed to receive a lot of critical acclaim and was very refreshing in a time when a lot of other movies like the MCU were starting to get rather stale. People wanted some new forms of storytelling. They wanted something that would tap into timeless themes and beauty. And Dune certainly taps into some of those timeless themes that we're all aspiring for. Because, well, in many ways, the story of Dune is all about the struggle of power that often occurs throughout history, when you really think about it. This entire story is basically a power struggle. I mean, many, if not all stories are about a power struggle, really, but this one emphasized the power struggle more so. I've said before in my previous review of Dune Part 1, this isn't necessarily a fun film, but it's still definitely a very immersive film because they describe their world building in a way in which everything is cohesive and everything makes sense. It delves into themes about geopolitical power and how it can shape people, how it can shape people getting into the conflict, and how it can affect people making drastic choices. So, as you know, the Dune series by Frank Herbert is set in the distant future, mainly surrounding a conflict of gathering this resource called spice on the planet of Arrakis. Whoever controls Arrakis controls the whole galaxy, because spice is such a powerful substance that whoever consumes or inhales it has the ability to have enhanced senses, as well as have increased chances of successful space travel, as well as having an increased boost in having supernatural prophecies. Yes, Dune very much delves into themes about politics and religion, which I find very intriguing to see people's different insights on those big topics and what they would imply for the respective stories that they're telling, because worldviews will always impact a person's outcome on things, and especially for authors, worldviews are going to heavily impact the way they write their stories. So for Frank Herbert, from what I can gather, he didn't really seem to be the kind of person who gravitated towards a particular worldview as if it was true. He was approaching things from a very practical standpoint, in a sense, in saying that these worldviews are useful and that they can influence the masses to gain control, and they can establish order and things like that. There's different themes about order, about beliefs, about the corruption of power. In the events of Dune Part 1, there is a conflict between the House Atreides and the Harkonens. They are in conflict with each other over the ownership of the planet Atticus, which is inhabited by the local Fremen, who know how to traverse the planet, especially given how it's an intense desert planet where water is scarcely found, and wherever you find the spice that they're looking for, these giant worms are guarding and can seek you and hunt you down if you cause too much of a rhythm. The late Duke Leto Atreides seemed to know full well that it was likely a trap going in, set up by the Emperor, but he went for it anyway, for the dignity of the Atreides household. And tragically, the Atreides household got bombarded by the Harkonnens. Paul and his mother, played by Timothée Chalamet and Rebecca Ferguson, managed to escape. So where we leave off in part 2, Paul and his mum have been able to find the Fremen and are now making plans to fight back, and for Paul personally, get revenge on the Harkonnens. In Dune Part 2, to make a brief summary before delving into spoiler territory, it tells the story of how Paul wins over the influence of the local Fremen to fight back against the Harkonnens, who have eliminated almost the entire Atreides household. Paul does so by going through a series of trials that the local Fremen have set up for him, as well as going through negotiations revolving around the fact that Paul is implied to be some kind of foretold messiah figure that the Fremen look up to and worship. Paul is also gaining the affections of one of the local Fremen that he kept seeing in his dreams, played here by Zendaya. And yes, this does cause a lot of concern that Spider-Man's girlfriend is smooching with Timothée Chalamet, as well as Zac Efron.
Until part 2 comes out, then it's all about this scrawny guy who tries making out with Spider-Man's girlfriend, who in turn has also been making out with that guy from Iron Claw. Alright.
There's a lot of conflict between Paul, his mum, and even between the Fremen about the legitimacy of these prophecies. But whether the people believe these prophecies or not, they're coming true as the events unfold. And so there's more plot links being involved in regards to the puppet string manipulation of the witch cult called the Bene Gesserit, who were responsible for Paul's mother, named Jessica's lineage in the first place. They were responsible for all the power struggle in the first place because the Bene Gesserit only care about power, and the Bene Gesserit were responsible for bringing about Paul into existence in the first place. The Bene Gesserit basically pull the strings on everything, and the only thing they care about is power for the sake of it. So these supernatural prophecies are coming true, and the people are thinking about the ramifications of what this would imply. And as the film progresses, Paul gradually wins more battles, manages to outsmart the Harkonnens more and more, and he starts to win over the favor of more and more Fremen, especially the fundamentalists. But as Paul wins more and more people, there's a threat that Paul could succumb to a dark form of corruption that could really taint his character. Paul even seems to be having more prophetic visions to imply that some corruption will come at the cost of the vengeance that he seeks. So in order to discuss this film further, we're gonna have to go into spoiler territory. So if you want to see Dune Part 2 for yourself, then feel free to skip this part, or you can skip the spoiler segment entirely to the point where I talk about the quality of the film itself. But nevertheless, you have been warned. So Paul Atreides is making out with Zendaya. I know she has a name, but I'm just going to call her Zendaya. And he's winning over her affections as well as the affections of the Fremen people, as well as winning against the Harkonnens, to the point where Paul manages to gain enough resources and people to fight off the Harkonnens and even the Emperor and his men with relative ease. So this film is less of an epic action film and more of a geopolitical drama, which I find really intriguing for reasons I'll delve more into later. Paul manages to win the battle. He finds out a revelation that seems to shake up a lot of things. Not only is Jessica actually pregnant with another child from the late Duke Leto's conception, this new child is going to be a daughter, and her thinking has been awakened by this ritual of this water of life stuff that comes from baby worms, and there's a lot of detail that goes into it, but to make a long story short, there seem to be implications that Jessica has other plans regarding her yet-to-be-born child that she holds in her womb. Paul is leading the armies to victory against the Emperor and the Harkonens, who have wronged the Atreides, and Paul also finds out that the Baron Harkonnen turns out to be his grandfather. Like, whoa, didn't see that one coming.
Wow, what a movie. What a movie was Dune Part 2. There were these two kangaroo mice that fell into a bucket of cream. One mouse was so white, he made Michael Jackson look like Zendaya. And the other mouse was so scrawny, he might as well be a mouse. Wow. You know, they literally call him a mouse. Timothy Chalamet, he's a mouse. He's a mouse man. He's a mouse man, and in the movie, they call him Mouse. Whoa.
And right as he successfully kills off the Baron, the Baron's nephew challenges Paul to an intense knife duel. Paul is very much wounded from the fight, but Paul manages to gain the upper hand in the end. And so, Paul indicates that he's interested in having the hand in marriage of the Emperor's daughter, which obviously breaks the heart of Zendaya's character. And to add insult to injury, Paul is having another prophetic vision of some other potential love interest played by Anya Taylor-Joy. You know, the young lady who looks like a living Tim Burton character. To make a long story short, victory is attained, but at what cost? Paul has now become corrupt with power, so it would imply. Yes, he's gained the victory. Yes, he's freed the Fremen. But he's had to compromise on his romantic relationship in order to achieve more power. And he's threatening the livelihood of other home planets that would threaten his pursuit for power. Whilst loose ends from part 1 are indeed wrapped up, some new storytelling possibilities are opened up because of Paul's decisions and his implied corruption into power. And so the film ends with Zendaya surfing on the worm away from all this, heartbroken indeed. So, now that I've given a brief summary of the film, what did I think of the film itself? I'd say for the most part, it carries off the same quality of filmmaking that was established in the first Dune film. It really carries on. And let's get the elephant out of the room. Part 2 is visually gorgeous. Like, this is one of the most visually gorgeous films I've ever seen. Like some of these visuals are something you'd see straight out of a dream. Like, there's an entire sequence where we see the Harkonnens' home planet, and it seems to be this very surreal, monochromatic nightmare where everything seems pale, but there's something very unsettling about it. It's really intriguing imagery. It's like sort of white in collaboration with like gray and black ink blobs. It's really intriguing imagery, and of course the intense yet also warm colors of Atticus are also very pleasing for the eyes as well. It's very clever how Dennis has been able to integrate the practical with the CGI in a way that doesn't overload the senses of the viewer. It's very impressive how he's able to achieve this kind of storytelling on a technical feat. Like, people used to think that adapting Dune would be impossible, but Dennis has proved them wrong. Yeah, I know there's gonna be people who will inevitably nitpick that these bits didn't quite follow the book, but here's the thing, even with some appraised film adaptations like The Lord of the Rings, some compromises need to be made for the sake of telling a story on screen. Although, it wouldn't surprise me if Dune Part 2 missed out on some details that were described in the book or something like that. I mean, maybe if they had like an extended edition, holding your pee longer kind of edition. Holding your pee, sorry, that's got me thinking about the way water is handled in the film. Other things that I really liked about the film. Making the characters quite likable. I remember people saying, oh, Zendaya's character, she was there, she existed, but I actually found her more likable in this part of the film. She had the chance and opportunity to actually grow as a character. She wasn't just some backdrop character, she was obviously one of the main characters. And Zendaya's character had the chance to be likable, showcase some character flaws, some vulnerabilities, seeing her laugh, seeing her have some casual banter, seeing her get angry or stand out from the crowd in a sort of arrogant kind of way where she should have just sat down. It's really interesting to see a character that feels pretty dynamic, so good on her for portraying that quite well. The other Fremen, this guy in particular, it's actually quite funny. You know, one of my most beloved experiences of going to a cinema is when a film is trying to portray some kind of humor or some kind of a joke, and then everyone in the audience laughs at it. I think that's the sign that the joke landed it exactly where it needed to land, and the people enjoyed it. Well done. It happened with Top Gun Maverick, it happened here. Congratulations, Dennis, you made the Fremen more likable. I suppose there are some practical effects put in there too, like the way they handle like the baby worm. It's really impressive how things can be actually quite authentic and how the effects are used quite sparingly, but I've already mentioned that, so what other aspects did I really enjoy? I find it interesting that the plot of this film is less about a typical action-backed good versus evil kind of narrative. It's more of a geopolitical drama. I mean, one of my few complaints about this film is that the Harkonnens don't seem to be as smart as they were in the previous parts. Maybe that's down to cockiness or something, but maybe they should have established that if that was the case. Yeah, the Harkonnens were not as smart in the second part as they were in the first part. But there is a strength in this film that more than makes up for that. It's the fact that there's so much emphasis on the geopolitical strategy as well as the conflict of religious ideology combined with Paul's internal pressures to be this Messiah figure, but also the impending doom of being corrupted by power if mishandled, as well as his increasing influence. And so it reaches the point where when he almost easily wipes out the Harkonnens and takes out the Emperor's men as well, it makes sense that Paul would have the upper hand both on a narrative and thematic level. It would make sense for Paul to have this kind of strategic mindset, but it would also make sense on a thematic basis to say, here is him at the peak of his power, and now there's a threat that he could get corrupted by it. So because of those thematics, I'd be quite happy if the Dune series ended with part 2. I know they're making plans to make a spin-off Bene Gesserit series, which, if I'm not mistaken, they're gonna put on HBO Max or something, and it would not surprise me if there were plans to make Dune Part 3. I mean, I wouldn't mind if that was the case, especially given how there's plenty of source material from Frank Herbert and his son, I think, to expand on the franchise. It'd be interesting if the Dune series ended off here, but I wouldn't mind if they kept going with Dune Part 3, because enough loose ends are wrapped up in Dune Part 1 so that Part 1 and Part 2 tells a cohesive story as a whole, and that any loose ends set up in Part 2 can be seen as building to Paul's corruption into power in the context of Part 2. So that's why, even though there are some new plot elements established, like the Anya Taylor-Joy character and the implications of going to war with other worlds, like, it wouldn't surprise me if they made Dune Part 3. I'd be curious to see how they would wrap up the loose ends set up in Dune Part 2. And I suppose, as someone who's very much fascinated by philosophical context, it's interesting to see how this kind of film can be interpreted, obviously with the way that the religion is set up in Dune, mainly due to Frank Herbert's inspiration from the Orange Catholic Bible, which is a whole hodgepodge of Abrahamic beliefs with Buddhism and stuff like that. I mean, there's obviously, from that kind of aspect, there's inevitably going to be many ways of interpreting this story. But even so, I find it interesting how this story, regardless of your beliefs, sets up a narrative of the potential danger of what happens if someone misuses too much power, as well as the implications of being a responsible savior for these people. I mean, inevitably, there's going to be disagreements, but I don't think this story is all about endorsing this belief system as such, because even the people within the film are conflicted about beliefs. I mean, I'm quite impressed with how this film handles the context of belief system, because just like in real life, even the people who would profess to believe one thing, even they have divided opinions. Like, you can take a look at real-world religions and political systems, and even amongst those different groups, you'll have people who are divided about fundamentals, or no, this should be interpreted metaphorically, or no, this isn't literally going to happen, it's meant to be symbolic, or no, every single word is literally going to happen, or oh, this person's downplaying his role, so that must mean it's false, right? No, this person's actually humbling himself on purpose, so that must mean it's true. So, I mean, sometimes it's handled in a humorous way in the context of the film, other times it's handled in a dramatic way, but I'm quite impressed that they went to that extent, because that actually does reflect real life in a lot of ways. And that's basically what Dune is. It's a science fiction that reflects real life. I mean, all stories in some way reflect real life eventually, because, as I said before, all worldviews have their consequences and all authors have their own input in the world, so all stories will have some kind of reflection of the real world in the first place. But what makes stories of timeless beauty are the kinds of films that can tell these truths that stay true regardless of the flowing of time, regardless of what the politics of the day are. Like, truth is truth, no matter who says it. And the more people can tap into that kind of timeless beauty, the more they'll be able to create art. So Dune taps into the timeless beauty of the dangers of getting too much power, the wrestling with belief systems, and so much stuff like that. Overall, how would I rate Dune Part 2? I mean, it's not entirely perfect. Like I said, the Harkonens are not really as smart as they were in the first part. Some people would argue that certain characters like Christopher Walken's Emperor and Anya Taylor-Joy's character are only there for A-list celebrity baiting to pull people in. But, I mean, I don't know. I mean, Christopher Walken was a pretty good choice for the Emperor for what small a role he had. Or how big a role, depending on the way you look at it. I suppose Anya Taylor-Joy's character will entice mystery. I assume they cast the right person, because Anya Taylor-Joy does have that odd yet still quite beautiful look about her, so I guess that's a good casting choice. So overall, it's a well-made film, and I would recommend you go see it just so you can get an idea of these kind of discussions and get these kind of thoughts in your head to think more constructively about how you view life and how you would interact with other people. But in the time being, how would I rate Dune Part 2? I think I'm going to give Dune Part 2 a 10.8 out of 12. It's a really well-made film, and yet it does have some issues, but not enough to detract from the overall quality of the film. The weaknesses of this film is that the Harkonnens are not as smart as they were in Part 1, the pacing can be just a little bit off at times, and some of the loose ends, as well as some other features like certain casting choices, namely in the smaller roles, might be a little distracting for people, but these are not weaknesses that I would say detract from the film's overall quality. I think Dune Part 2 is a really well-made film overall, and I would highly recommend you go see it. But to those of you who have taken the time to see Dune Part 2, what do you think of the film? Let me know down below in the comments below. Down below in the comments down below. Yeah, way to go smoothly with your words, Cal. That's not how you entice people. How do you think Dune Part 2 holds up to other epics or stuff like that? Let me know in the comments down below, and I look forward to future discussions. In the meantime, ScotsThinker signing out.
And so, this mouse does not drown in a bucket of cream because there's little to no cream or an arachis. How do they get the calcium to grow? I suppose there's very little milk.